Okay, it's starting. Okay, we're beginning. Do you want me to begin?
Yes, you are the introducer.
I'm the introducer. Well, welcome everyone to our SAF's presentation on academic mobbing. We're going to have hopefully an interesting discussion today between our various participants. And I'm the Zoom host of this session, so I'm not actually going to be doing much other than organizing the chat and hopefully not muting people who maybe forget to shut off their microphones. So please remember to mute and unmute yourself only when you're ready to talk. We'll be having some questions at the end of the talk, and I will be the individual in charge of that. So you just will have to send your messages, or you can send a message to me in chat, and I'd be very happy to put you in the queue at the end. So I'm going to turn this over to Kristen.
No, me. I'll talk first.
Oh, to Francis, sorry. Please,
we did organize this ahead of time, but in all the giddiness, we lost our way. Anyway, thank you very much, Robert. My name is Francis Widdowson. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies, and I am a board member for the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship and the founder of the Rational Space Network at Mount Royal University. And both of those organizations have sponsored this event today. Both organizations regard this subject as being very important in universities right now. Everyone has probably heard of the terms cancel culture. And I guess mobbing is sort of the groundswell that emerges that results in people being deprived of their livelihood. And for professors, that essentially means ending their career as a professor. And I've been thinking about this subject for quite some time, even before my current circumstances emerged, which I will talk about more when I'm a panelist. But it really started to become a concern for me when I saw the case of Rick Mata, first of all, and then even worse was the case of Ricardo Duchenne. And I started thinking about the case of Ricardo Duchenne, was actually contacted by him, I guess, a number of months ago, sort of asking why, Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship hadn't really done more to defend him, which I thought was a little bit unfair, because we did defend Duchenne quite aggressively at the time, but still, I think there is much more that needs to be said about the Duchenne case. And I had originally hoped that Ricardo Duchenne was going to be part of this panel, but because of his settlement with the University of New Brunswick, he's not able to talk about his case. And so it was thought that this would be awkward. So we're hoping within the next couple months to have another event where Duchenne can actually talk about some of the controversial scholarship that he has been engaged in, and we can get a little bit more into the open as to some of the issues that are at stake that resulted in him being pushed out of the University of New Brunswick at St. John. Anyway, so that's the plan today, is to get into mobbing as a phenomenon, which we have, and I'll let Kirsten Kramer, who's going to be the moderator, introduce the panelists. But we want to have some general background on the phenomenon of academic mobbing. And then we are going to have two people who have actually been mobbed at universities talk about their particular cases. And interestingly, their mobs overlap. So there's people who have been involved in both mobs who are included within sort of the inner circle. And then we have a philosopher and a criminologist sort of kind of try to tie things together a little bit and provide their commentary on the situation. Anyway, that's going to be the plan. And then we will, once we have a general discussion amongst the panelists, we will open up the event for question and answers, a question and answer session. And I believe if you just put your name in the chat function, then Robert, who's the Zoom master, is going to be taking a look at your organizing the speakers list and so on. That's going to happen. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this event. What I'm going to do now is turn it over to Kirsten Kramer, who is going to introduce the panelists. Kirsten Kramer is a professor, contract faculty member at both the University of Calgary and Mount Royal University. She was a professor, a full professor at the University of Winnipeg, and has done a great amount of research into free speech, issues of free speech, and the academy, hate speech legislation, and all sorts of related matters that have some bearing upon this topic. Anyway, without more further ado, I will now turn it over to Kirsten Kramer. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Francis. You would never know we met ahead of time because I thought that Robert was going to be introducing everyone, so I didn't pull up your bios, everyone. But I do have the order that we're going to be presenting in today, starting with Ken Westhues. And Ken is a professor emeritus, I believe correctly, at the University of Waterloo, sociologist for many, many years who has expertise in academic mobbing. We're going to start with Ken and then move to Rebecca Tuvel. And then Francis is going to speak, and Paul and I will try to come together to draw out some themes from the presentations that we hear from today. So we'll start with Ken.
Thanks, Kirsten. Good afternoon, everybody. Happy first day of spring. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes? Wait, yes? Good. It's fun to be here, and it's really nice to see names and faces that I haven't come across for a while. And just as I glance through, I see Gabor Lukács. I haven't heard anything of him for a good while except the airplane stuff. And Rhoda Hassman. And Barbara, that's Barbara Kay, it looks to me like. Yes, it's good to see you again. Mark Mercer and Janice Arini and Scott Davies. It's very nice to be here, and it's nice for this gathering. So I'm grateful to be invited. Italian sociologist Francesco Alberoni devoted much of his career to the odd, exceptional human phenomenon of falling in love, describing it as a two-person social movement sealed by fanatic mutual attraction. I've devoted much of my career to an equally odd, exceptional, but contrasting kind of social movement, workplace mobbing. Not dyadic attraction and affection, but collective revulsion and aggression. The fanatic ganging up of a bunch of people on a despised workmate whom they seek to disgrace, punish, and in the long run eliminate. I didn't invent this field. The Swedish psychologist Heinz Lehmann did that in the 1980s, building on earlier studies of mobbing among birds and animals by Austrian ethologist Konrad Lorenz. My goal has been to develop the field, to enlarge our understanding of mobbing, especially in universities, and in particular to lodge the word mobbing in people's vocabularies so that they can recognize this terrifying social process when it unfolds before their eyes. The concept of falling in love makes life more intelligible. When I see a teenage girl whom I know to be generally sensible and prudent, suddenly acting strange, drawn to some boy as if magnetically, obsessed with him, smitten, enraptured, blind to his flaws, but with 20/20 vision for his strengths, my puzzlement is reduced once I recognize that she has fallen in love. What she sees in the boy, I'll never know, but that's how it is. No grand theory is required. Falling in love is just something that happens among humans, rooted in innate biological impulses. It's a thing. Having a name for it helps us to make sense of life. Similarly, when I see normal, rational professors who customarily behave as scholars with fiercely independent minds, coalescing around shared visceral antipathy toward a colleague, blind to the colleague's talents and strengths, but fixated on his or her failings and faults, hell-bent on harassing, humiliating, and getting rid of him or her, my puzzlement is reduced when I recognize that these folks have formed themselves into a workplace mob. No grand theory is required. Mobbing, the enactment of collective hate, is just something that happens among humans, professors included. It's a thing. Having a name for it, understanding what it involves, makes academic life more intelligible. My research this past quarter century has consisted mainly of studying one mobbing case after another, and then piecing together, by the method of analytic induction, a set of propositions about the nature, causes, and consequences of this terrifying social process. The good news is that the science of mobbing has progressed. Google Scholar reports just 60 articles, books, and book chapters on workplace mobbing between 2000 and 2004, 60 items. For the most recent 5-year period, 2015 to 2019, the number is 986. The same trend is observed for specifically academic mobbing, from 3 publications in the first period to 115 in the most recent one. Google Scholar misses, moreover, many of the best contributions to the research literature, like Yves Seguin's 2016 trenchant article in University Affairs about how to become campus tormentors, or the detailed 2019 expose in the Swiss magazine République of the dismissal of astronomy professor Marcella Carollo from ETH Zurich. It also misses the long series of articles on academic mobbing in the e-zine Quillette, including Brad Cran's 2018 overview of the field and analysis of the case of Stephen Galloway at UBC, Barbara Kay's 2018 analysis of the case of Ahmed Fakhri Ibrahim at McGill, the editor's 2018 dissection of the ouster of Noah Carl from Cambridge, and in 2020, Alberta anthropologist Kathleen Lowry's splendid first-person account of what she calls her strange feminist journey. And in 2021, Chicago geophysicist Dorian Abbott's first-person account of his encounter with what he calls, it's a nice quote, a crowd of people who have lost their individuality in a frenzy of group madness. There's good news in particular about the kind of academic mobbing most common in our time, namely the mobbing of dissenters from postmodernism, aka cultural Marxism, relativism, critical race theory, or wokeism, that has gradually overtaken Western academe since the 1960s. 25 years ago, this orthodoxy was pretty much taken for granted, so that when a professor was mobbed for transgressing it, this was generally assumed to be administration of social justice. We owe a huge debt to the scholars who cast doubt on this orthodoxy, brought its tyranny to light with concepts like political correctness, social justice warrior, John Feketa's moral panic, John Furity's velvet totalitarianism, and Alan Korz's shadow university, and to the countervailing organizations they created, SAFs, the NAS, the FIRE, the Free Speech Union. I remember with gratitude the names of those who inspired and founded SAFs. John and Chris Furity, Doreen Kimura, John Mueller, Heinz Klatt, Phil Sullivan, Dick Henschel, Judy Wubning, among others. In society at large, the spell of leftist political correctness has been broken. And this allows the mobbing of politically incorrect professors, among many others, to be more easily recognized and questioned. New digital media, the blogosphere and Twitterverse, have brought diverse viewpoints to the fore. The Trump presidency, Brexit, and populist unrest across the Western world excuse me, signify vibrant opposition to the political and cultural ethos of people like Tony Blair, Bill and Hillary Clinton, Justin Trudeau, Michael Ignatieff, Joe Biden, and Kamala Harris. Culture is more volatile than formerly. It's kind of wild out there, as those of you currently teaching on campus know better than I. People get canceled right and left. One upshot is that mobbings rooted in postmodernism more often backfire. That's a process Brian Martin in Australia has analyzed with much insight. I recommend his website. 5 years ago, Jordan Peterson was the target of a woke mob that aimed to banish him from a respectable company. I sent him an email of concern. He wrote back that he thought he had weathered the storm. As things turned out, he did more than that. He adroitly turned the storm back on its instigators and turned himself into one of the most prominent public intellectuals in the world. Rebecca Tuvel's adversaries hoped to silence her when they collectively demanded that the journal Hypatia withdraw her reasonable comparison of transgenderism and transracialism. But publicity seems to have nipped that incipient mobbing in the bud. Tuvel's institution has stood behind her. Colleagues have come to her defense. Her argument has gotten more attention, and her reputation has acquired more luster than if the campaign against her article had never been launched. It's a fine example of what's called the Streisand effect. Yet amidst this turbulence, mobbing of the postmodern kind continues regularly to be carried to its ideal conclusion, namely ridding the campus of the targeted professor. Ricardo Deschênes was eased into early retirement from UNB in 2019 after his colleagues in sociology and other disciplines signed collective denunciations of his scholarship as racist, white supremacist, and devoid of academic merit. HuffPost publicized this caricature far and wide. Deschênes' sin was that he generally admires Western civilization and wants to explain empirically its power and inventiveness. His further sin is to be so smart and work so hard as to produce a larger, more coherent body of scholarship than, wild guess, 95% of UNB professors. As if these offenses were not enough, he is kind of a foreigner, having been born in Puerto Rico and bearing an Hispanic first name. One of my books on mobbing is entitled The Envy of Excellence. Deschênes' case is archetypal. Now, the direction of our conversation this afternoon remains to be seen. We can discuss specific cases of academic mobbing, especially the two on the panel, since each one yields fresh insight into the nature of the beast. We can talk about how to recognize mobbing, its hallmarks and indicators, distinguish different kinds of it, debate what kind of academics are most vulnerable, pinpoint predisposing conditions, and common consequences. All these topics are important. All are treated in books, articles, and research reports on my own and others' websites. Whatever direction our conversation takes, I'm grateful to have been invited to take part, and I look forward to hearing the views of my fellow panelists. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ken. We'll move on now to hear from Rebecca. Rebecca?
Yes, great. Thank you so much. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm gonna share my screen. So let's make sure I can do that okay here. Hopefully y'all can see that. One second here. Okay, so make it like this. You can still see it, right? So Sorry. Okay, well, I'm going to say a bit about my particular experience. There we go, apologies. And so give some background for any of you who are unfamiliar with my case, and then say a bit about how I understand what happened and how I think we need to move forward in academia. Right, so in March 2017, my article in defense of transracialism was published online at the feminist philosophy journal Hypatia. And in that article, I argue that similar ethical considerations in rightful support of transgender identity apply also to transracial identity. And my interest in this topic was sparked in 2015 when former NAACP chapter head Rachel Dolezal was outed as having white parents despite presenting herself as a Black woman for over a decade. And in fact, her parents are the ones who outed her. Meanwhile, that same month, Caitlyn Jenner graced the cover of Vanity Fair, signaling a growing acceptance of transgender identity. And so, like many at the time, I was struck by the wildly divergent reactions to these two individuals. Jenner was widely lauded and Dolezal was pretty much unanimously condemned. And yet in my research on the topic, I found that the pre-existing philosophical literature had failed to adequately consider the ethical possibility of transracial identity. So, I knew my article was forwarding a controversial argument because other philosophers who had weighed in online fora mostly were not sympathetic to this idea, but I certainly didn't expect the response that I got. So what I'm going to do is just tell you what that response was, give you at least what I think is one key diagnosis of it, and say a bit about those future directions. All right, so if you trace the Hypatia affair, as it has been dubbed, back to its origins, you will discover a Twitter and Facebook, a sociology graduate student that sparked the entire controversy. And so it starts out by saying, who's on the editorial board at Hypatia? I honestly want to talk about this absolutely disgusting and harmful legitimization of transracial identity, et cetera, et cetera. And then in the next paragraph, she says, who wants to put together some kind of letter because I refuse to allow this garbage to gain traction. If anyone has institutional access and wouldn't mind sending me a copy so I can read it and properly put forth a response, I would deeply appreciate it. So despite admitting that they hadn't yet read my article, that didn't prevent the response that then took place. So in the wake of this post, there were calls for the retraction of my article. There were people posting my course lists online and calling for me to be fired and to contact individuals on my tenure committee. I was attacked on Facebook and Twitter and, accused of a whole host of horrible things. And, I had former feminist advisors reach out to try to get me to retract my article myself, telling me that what I argued was inherently problematic and that I should abandon my book project, apologize for publishing my paper, and otherwise it would destroy my career. So while all that was going on, some folks associated with Hypatia kind of were talking online about contacting the journal or writing an open letter to get my paper pulled, right? I'm on the editorial board, let's get together and cancel this person. Being penned, and about 800 academics signed it. Many influential feminist philosophers signed it. And then just 2 days later, the associate editorial board at Hypatia issued an apology for publishing my article. And I have the actual Hypatia here, Hypatia of Alexandria, who ironically was accused of witchcraft and killed by an angry mob in 415 CE. So, all right, so that's kind of a rundown of what happened, and I can say more about that in Q&A if you want. I'll say briefly that, you know, being on the receiving end of this kind of a online mob triggered a psychological response I would have honestly never anticipated. You know, I don't have bipolar disorder, but I had a manic episode in response to the event. You know, I had felt a disturbing desire to disappear that was very unfamiliar and unsettling to me. I became extremely paranoid that people would dredge up material about me online and use it to kind of cancel me. And it was really terrifying. And I think that, you know, mobbing throughout history has obviously been prevalent, as we just learned, and horrible. But I think the online mobbing context is far worse for a few reasons. One is there's a total lack of accountability. A lot of the mobbers are anonymous or behind pseudonyms. We're talking about huge amounts of people, hundreds or maybe thousands, and there's a permanent online record. You can't process it and move past it, right? Justine Sacco, who's featured in John Ronson's book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, discusses this a bit and how she would try to date years after being mobbed, and you know, the first thing people would learn about her is, you know, this what she tweeted, which in fact wasn't even that bad, I don't think, but that's a topic for another day. Okay, I should say, you know, as Ken noted, my experience actually was bad for only a brief amount of time. I got tons of support from fellow philosophers and fellow feminist philosophers, and that's really what kept me in academia. I think I would have left otherwise. I mean, it was not a friendly space and not the space that I thought it was. So, you know, I got about 1,000 emails from philosophers and academics supporting me, you know, some of whom were self-identified trans people and people of color. And so, you know, in the end, I was not, you know, canceled. All right, so why this response, right? Why is this happening? So I've come to really think that we can't understand what's happening in cases like mine without appreciating the dynamics of group identity online. So, you know, I think when we think about identities and group identities and how they function, you know, they're molded within and sustained within communities. And I think for folks within the community of academic feminist philosopher, right, part of what it means to be that identity is to be recognized by the community of academic feminist philosophers or feminists more generally. And I think that those group identities are so central to people's self-understanding that when somebody comes along and threatens to undermine the agreed upon beliefs or, you know, sacred values that the group upholds, they're experienced as threatening the integrity of that group. So I think what you get then is in-group members banding together and trying to sort of reassert their shared values to try to re-solidify their groups. I think this also explains why at the time so many feminists and academic philosophers were actually explicitly called out on Facebook and Twitter for not showing their allegiance to the cause against me. So one philosopher in particular was on Facebook going around saying things like, please don't be silent, and quote, just watch yourselves because we're watching how you handle this. So there were calls made for, you know, you better show that you are a good group member. And if you don't, you know, you might get canceled or you will get canceled. In fact, one feminist who works in trans theory tried to voice a dissenting opinion, and she was told to quote, fuck off, and trans folks can't trust her anymore. So that individual was the self-appointed spokesperson for all trans folks, apparently. Okay. Yeah, and I was going to say too, right? Clearly, it doesn't take much for one to get ostracized these days, to get labeled a TERF, trans exclusionary radical feminist, which people say horrible things about TERFs online. It's really disturbing. And you can get that label attached to you even in an article that is explicitly pro-transgender, like mine was. You know, I said repeatedly that it was coming from a place of support. Okay, so I think this is all really terrifying for all reasons that we'll discuss. And I don't want to take up too much more time with just my presentation here before we get to Q&A. So let me just say a few things about what I think this implies for moving forward in academia. So, you know, I'm encouraged by groups like Heterodox Academy and others who figure some of these problems in terms of the lack of viewpoint diversity, especially in online spaces, and how, you know, there isn't enough of an appreciation for the importance of speaking across difference and disagreement, and that, you know, the polarization of online spaces is contributing to more extremism and therefore more likelihood that people react strongly to dissenting views. So I think that, you know, these kinds of organizations and movements to increase viewpoint diverse environments are important. But I'm also concerned about whether or not that response is sufficient. So this philosopher, T. Nguyen, makes this distinction between epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. Epistemic bubbles are informational networks from which relevant voices have been excluded by omission, but echo chambers are social structures from which other relevant voices have been actively discredited. Oh, what's happening online is more echo chambers than epistemic bubbles. And so if you're dealing with an echo chamber, as opposed to an epistemic bubble, it's not likely that, you know, the introduction of diverse views is going to be effective, right? Because those views are already discredited. So in fact, the problem is much deeper and scarier, because you're not going to have people welcoming a different view. So, you know, I think we need a different response. The philosopher Robert Talisse recently published this book called Overdoing Democracy, in which he argues that, you know, if you properly understand how polarization works, right, you understand that when we're surrounded by people who agree with us, we become more confident in our beliefs, and then we become more extreme versions of ourselves. We adopt more extreme commitments to our views. And so the thing that we need to do is somehow break the polarization dynamic, he says, by engaging in more non-political cooperative activities, but also recognize the likely effects of polarization on our own beliefs. Well, I'm just going to leave that there for now, because that's not a full answer, but these are some of the things that I'm interested in thinking about as far as breaking some of these dynamics are concerned. So thank you. Sorry, I think I took a little longer there than I was meant to.
Thanks, Rebecca. That was great. We'll move to Francis now. You have to unmute yourself, Francis.
Sorry about that. I'm trying to share my screen here. I'm not sure if this is going to work.
You're muted. Okay, you got that.
Can people see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. Oops. I tried to guard against the dappling, but it seems to be dappling in terms of my window, but hopefully the sun won't move too quickly across the sky. Anyway, so I wanted to give you my experience. I'm a bit different from Rebecca in that I was prepared for the mob when the mob came for me. And for me, it's a matter of toughening up. You need to toughen up. And so if anyone is, you know, in an area there where they have controversial research, get prepared and think a little bit about how you're going to deal with it. And so these are, and now I think that Walter White is probably the best role model in this regard, and just become, you know, try to make yourself so tough that it's going to be difficult for people to feel, you know, that they're going to be able to take you down. We'll see if it works. It didn't work out well for Walter, so maybe it won't work out all that well for me. But I am dug in, seriously dug in, and I want my adversaries to know that if they want to go after me, they're going to have work on their hands to be able to do that. So what I'd like to do is just tell you about my case, and then do similarly to what Rebecca did, which is to give you my thoughts on what I think is happening, especially as Ken was mentioning with respect to the reified postmodernism, wokeism aspect. So in terms of my case, I've actually been mobbed twice. The first time was in 2008, and the second time was in 2021. The first case never really got off the ground, so it was a bit of a test run. And that was when I was giving a presentation at the beginning of my time at Mount, well, I hadn't actually started at Mount Royal yet, for the Canadian Political Science Association. And I was criticizing Indigenous theories and methodologies. It was a very, very animated session. People kind of it was a meltdown. It was a bit of a meltdown. And I thought one political scientist had acted in a completely outrageous fashion. And I thought, you know, but I wasn't all that concerned about it. And then I found out after the fact that the Women's Caucus was mobilizing to have me charged with hate speech for doing this at the Canadian Political Science Association. Fortunately, two political scientists, Janet Agenstadt and Catherine Frillbach, defended me publicly, which is important. Public defense is important, because if it's just private, people don't know, you know, they don't know that people are supporting you, and you're more vulnerable. And so that got demobilized, that effort. And I've been able to continue to go to the Canadian Political Science Association, but I'm ostracized. So I can't present work with other political scientists who study Indigenous issues. So I'm usually on panels with people who have nothing to do, their work has nothing to do with my work. So, but that was kind of, I guess, what they saw as being the best way forward to stop future meltdowns, basically. Recently, a much more serious mobbing effort is underway, and it's ongoing. So we don't know where this is going to go. Just to give you a bit of an idea about why it's so serious, there's been a mob forming since 2019. So that mob has been in existence, and it started with the Navabi talk. Armin Navabi was giving a presentation, and it was canceled and this group wrote to the administration complaining about it. And there were 30 members who wrote to administration, and I still don't have the letter that they sent or the names of the people who did it, because I can't get it off of Mount Royal, and I have to go through Freedom of Information, and it's going to go to an inquiry in 2022. So that's another problem, which I'll talk to you about shortly, which is administration kind of enabling the mob. And this had terrible consequences at Mount Royal, because presumably that same group of people wrote another letter to administration denouncing a faculty member, Mark Hecht, who was pushed out. He was a contract member, didn't have tenure, was pushed out of Mount Royal. So anyway, so this mob was kind of already in existence. Then with my situation, which began to unfold, which, you know, no one was particularly happy about me being at Mount Royal, but with the George Floyd killing and the Black Lives Matter movement, I got engaged in a social media, a Twitter kind of situation, which is quite complicated, which I'm not going to get into. I did write about it in the SAFS newsletter, which talks about it if people are interested. But basically 2 anonymous Twitter accounts got formed. One was a supposedly student Twitter account. The other was a faculty Twitter account, and these anonymous Twitter accounts started going after me online. Unlike Rebecca, and as well, I should mention my colleague Sinclair McRae, who I believe is here. He wrote a wonderful piece in defense of me, which had no effect at all. People just ignored it. But I decided to take the bull by the horns and went after the mob satirically, engaged in satirical warfare against the mob with my anonymous Twitter account, Francis McGrath. And this kind of really brought things to a head. So things might have sort of bubbled along. The mob became very enraged. And as a result, a petition was put forward by a student, supposedly, but probably faculty members were involved in this, and 6,000 signatures. And the administration was sort of waffled a little bit, but they generally stood back and didn't really do anything, which was probably the best thing that one could have hoped for. But unfortunately, new tactics are being engaged in, which I cannot talk about. If I talk to you about them, I could be disciplined. So, but they are very disturbing, and because they're secretive, it is a very, very nasty business, which I'm currently engaged in. And I am fighting with everything that I have. I am throwing everything that I can at whatever's going on right now. And so we're not sure where it's gonna end up. It's uncertain at this time. But I am currently acting within the system to try to fight everything that's happening. So that's what's happened with respect to me. In terms of a few kinds of discussions about where things are going and why they are the way they are, because I've been at Mount Royal since 2008, and I was tolerated, and some people even welcomed my contributions for quite a while. And it was really 2015 where things started to go off the rail, or things seemed to deteriorate. And there's a couple of reasons for this. The administration changed. So we used to have a very academically oriented administration, and they became what's called diversity managerialists. So corporatized university, and we're very concerned about Mount Royal's brand, which is "you belong here." And this is just, raw meat for this mob to say, we're going to just sit down and talk to people and try to figure out how we can do better, how we can listen, and so on, when really it needs to be stood up to in a big way, the situation. The faculty association has been completely captured. Used to be a great faculty association. Now it has been captured by a bunch of ideologues, and that has made things very, very difficult because we're reliant on faculty associations. And the student population has changed quite substantially. We used to have freedom of expression used to be very strongly supported. Now it's pretty much, this what's called reified postmodernism, which Ken got into a little bit, colloquially known as wokeism, which is a relativist philosophy which combined with identity politics, and now is asserting itself in a totalitarian way on the entire university. This situation has been, the terrain has been laid out by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, which I have the copy of their book there. They kind of map out the terrain of how this has happened. And then, so in terms of my own advice, I guess, on how to deal with this, toughen up. You have got to make the mob think and the administration think that you are not going to be an easy customer. And so channel your inner Walter White and, make things as difficult as you possibly can for the mob. And do not apologize. This is the worst thing that you can do. And, plea bargaining, this is a huge problem. When people leave the university, get paid out. I said to the Faculty Association, there will be no plea bargain. We will fight this out to the end. So everyone is aware of this situation. Really, I think we need to organize Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, entities like the Rational Space Network. We need to find out who professors are who support freedom of expression and academic freedom, get these people into organizations, give them backing so that we can sort of have strength in numbers. And then in the end, currently I am working within the system. I am using every process that I have at my disposal, but I have been documenting everything. Everything is very well documented. And if things do not go my way, I will make everything public. That is what I'm going to do, because I think once we get out of the university system with people who actually are not captured by this ideology, I think people will understand just how terrible things have become at some universities in Canada. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Frances. Paul? You need to unmute yourself. Take a shot, everyone.
My job here wasn't to actually have a presentation. I'm the gadfly, and I just want to set up a number of observations and questions for the other panel members. One thing I want to bring to everyone's attention here is that freedom of expression is always the battle cry of whomever's being silenced. Like, I'm old enough in the tooth. I clearly remember the 60s, the early 60s, late 60s, when it was the left that was being silenced, and there was the left that was crying out for freedom of expression, and that was met with billy clubs. And of course, the thing about billy clubs is that 9 times out of 10 they kind of backfire, and I suspect that, first of all, it hasn't yet come to billy clubs yet, but it will, by the way. This is eventually it eventually eventuates in violence, but one of the things about the billy clubs of the late 60s is that eventually people, it's a little bit like banning a studio will take a banned movie all the way to the bank, and so one advantage, of course, of once the billy clubs are brought out is that that pretty much guarantees the success of the protesters. It just so happens that right now it's the so-called right that's being silenced, but there's nothing new about this. One thing that we have to appreciate is that universities have always been a political battleground. So, I mean, if we think about it, even here in Canada, and especially in the United States, most universities in the United States and some of them in Canada were originally founded as theological schools, and there was no freedom of expression in a theological school. I mean, you're there to learn to walk a particular walk and talk a particular talk. So if you think about the long history of academia under Nazi Germany, in the Soviet Union, Pol Pot, this idea that somehow universities are supposed to be these cauldrons of free thought and exchange, this is, first of all, a very recent idea, and also not a particularly long-lived idea. I mean, it really has only perhaps enjoyed this window of maybe 50, 60 years. And so, it's this idea of like, we get used to, it only takes 50, 60 years to get used to a particular norm, and we forget that 'twas not always thus. And perhaps may not always be in the future. So one of the things is just to kind of get this whole thing in context. It's always been the case. It's always been the case that that the academy is there for a particular political purpose, and it just so happens right now that the academy has been taken over by what Frances calls wokeism, whatever you want to call it. There's nothing new under the sun, and there's certainly nothing new about this, especially if you think back to the 60s. The other, a couple of other points I wanted to make with respect to Rebecca's presentation. I'm reminded, when you're trying to figure out what's the actual dynamic going on. Again, it kind of helps to have a kind of a wider, not only philosophical background, but also a wider theological background, as you do in my case. And that is, this is René Girard. I don't know if Rebecca's familiar with René Girard, but René Girard was famous for providing an account of what the Christ event is all about. And he claimed that what the Christ event is all about is that there's nothing fancy or metaphysical about it, right? He was a Christian, a Catholic theologian, but what he wanted to say is that this is God saying to human beings, okay, you've had this practice called scapegoating. Whenever there's a problem in the community, there's this kind of natural tendency that what you want to do is we can fix the problem by, pretending to be cutting out the cancer. And so this is what happens when I want you to, so God is saying to humanity, take a look at Christ. This is what happens when you scapegoat the entirely innocent person. Are you sure this is something you want to do? So in other words, it's a kind of a shaming, a kind of an embarrassment, right? Now, you can use René Girard's insight in this matter, assuming that he's got something going. You can use this insight by saying, okay, let's start exposing what this does, what this scapegoating does to perfectly innocent people like Rebecca or like Francis. Although I happen to know Francis much better, and I can attest that Francis is probably the very opposite of innocent. I mean, but I'm looking at this cherubic face of Rebecca, and I'm saying, that's just what innocence looks like. And so, like you're going after the wrong person.
Know me well enough either, then.
But here's the other thing: is that notice that people generally go after somebody who's widely regarded to be vile for independent reasons. So because Frances had already made herself vile for independent reasons, it was easy to go after her. And the same thing happened, I'm hoping some of you are familiar with what happened here at the University of Lethbridge with the Tony Hall affair. The thing about Tony Hall is that he's probably the last poster boy you ever want to put up for academic freedom, right? He's just, so it's very easy to go after him because nobody wanted to come to his defense because a lot of people didn't like him, right? So if you're looking for a scapegoat, what you want to do is you want to pick out somebody who, people just generally don't like, right? I've tried myself to make myself as unlikable as I possibly can here at the University of Lethbridge, so that people will go after me because unlike Frances, right? I mean, I'm jealous of Frances' position because Frances got 6,000 signatures demanding her dismissal. If you look at my blog site, I say things which are, 100 times more offensive than anything that Frances has ever come up with. I noticed that Rebecca's laughing because she's taken a look at it and she knows I'm right. I can't get a single letter demanding my resignation. Nothing. Try to make yourself vile, kind of. All right. So I don't know what I think the problem is that I have way too much of a sense of humor, and that's kind of that. I think humor is a great defense in this kind of thing. Frances tried that with Francis McGrath to some degree, I think successful. But so just a couple of comments about that. The Tony Hall case here at the University of Lethbridge was not so much a case of academic mobbing, because in that case, the mob came from outside the university. So in Francis's case, the mob came from inside the university, and in Rebecca's case, the mob came from perhaps outside her own university, but nevertheless came from within her own discipline, feminist ethics and so on. Whereas in the Tony Hall case, the attack did not come from fellow academics. In the Tony Hall case, it came from outside institutions like B'nai B'rith. So for those of you who don't know about the Tony Hall case, Tony, first of all, he's a 9/11 truther, no big deal. So is like something like 3/4 of the rest of the world. But Tony made the mistake of conjecturing that it might have been Israeli Secret Service that was involved in this so-called inside job. Of course, B'nai B'rith got hold of this. Well, any criticism of the state of Israel is anti-Semitism. So of course, B'nai B'rith demanded that he be fired, et cetera, et cetera. And he also made the unpardonable sin. Tony, by the way, is an historian. That's his training. He's a PhD in history. And as a historian, he said, listen, I think every historical event, it's the job of historians to put it back on the table and revisit it, including the Holocaust. Well, of course, as we all know, right, to even put the question of the historicity of the Holocaust on the table is already to demonstrate yourself, that is already to be a Holocaust denier. Which, of course, given the inferential stupidity of politicians here in Alberta and so on and so forth, but just got, oh, Tony Hall's a Holocaust denier. Well, he wasn't. He isn't. Even if he is, which he isn't, this is hardly some kind of dismissible sin. That's what historians do, right? As they revise history. You can imagine something similar happening in, Texans regard the myth of the Alamo as kind of, every culture has every society has a foundation myth. And so the Alamo is the foundation myth of Texas. And so, you've got this song, the men came from Texas and from old Tennessee, and they joined up with Travis just to fight for the right to be free. And this is exactly, what the myth that drives, this kind of, the Texan mentality, except that those people came from Tennessee to fight against Mexico, because Mexico had abolished slavery 30 years earlier. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to make sure that Texas would become and remain a slave state. So these people had come from Texas to fight for the right to own slaves. Not exactly a good battle cry, right? But nevertheless, you can imagine a similar thing happening to what happened to Tony if in Texas. I mean, if people started, pointing out in Texas and Texas universities the myth of the Alamo, and there was actually, an attempt to maintain slavery, probably they would have got mobbed by the Texas Rangers or by the Texas government and so on and so forth, right? So there's nothing peculiar about any of these things. I would like to say a few words about faculty associations. I've been looking at the history of this thing, not just at the University of Lethbridge, but pretty much across the country, and faculty associations have turned quisling. And there's a particular reason for that. And that is that faculty associations are staffed by people who want to get some administrative experience, precisely because they're careerists. They want to climb up the corporate ladder within the university. So once they're in the faculty association, they want to make sure that, let's say, a couple of years after they leave the faculty association, they become assistant deans, and then from deans, they become deans, and so on and so forth. So the last thing they want to do is to confront the administration. And so as a result of that, faculty associations consistently throw people under the bus. Faculty associations are quislings. It's built into the very structure of how a faculty association functions in a university. So again, if later on, when we're looking at solutions, there's a number of things we can possibly think about doing about this. One of them being that no president or officer of a faculty association shall ever serve in administration, right? Just a way of kind of precluding that possibility. Wanted to make something about confidentiality. I am in a privileged position. The University of Lethbridge violated my confidentiality way back in the year 2002. And again, it was one of those kind of O-ring kind of things. But the point is that, I brought it to their attention. Hey, you violated the confidentiality guarantees. I was serving on a committee that required a guarantee of confidentiality. The university violated it. When I brought it to the attention, they wouldn't repair they refused to, it was kind of like, well, too bad, right? That kind of thing. So I said, all right, from now on, I don't serve in any committees involving guarantees of confidentiality. And of course, they can't call me on it because, they know perfectly well that they're actually guilty, but they didn't want to have to admit that they were guilty. But the thing is this, confidentiality agreements have about the same legal value as toilet paper. They can't be enforced because it's so easy to leak it, right? I mean, it's just the easiest thing in the world. And so, people who are terribly concerned about confidentiality. So what happens is administrations try to use the confidentiality thing, and they're using it against, Frances right now. And Frances is, quite frankly, just, she's not being clever about this. I mean, she's accepting this constraint on her behavior. Big mistake. Don't accept it. Leak it. Just these inadvertent, like when you're playing it with an email and you kind of press, have you ever done this? You press this finger, right? You press the wrong, so you press send. Oh my God, I didn't mean to do that. The easiest thing in the world to do. Because of course, administrations love to hide behind this confidentiality, insistence, right? I think that's a big mistake. Just a couple more points, just a minute. I wanted to make this point about one of the consequences of mobbing. And one of the consequences of mobbing is that somebody who if you were to deal with respect and as a colleague and sit down and just talk to them and say, hey, listen, I don't think you're right about that particular thing, and now you engage them, that keeps them within the academic community. That keeps them within the community of thinkers. Now, the particular example I want to use is not actually an academic, but her name is Monica Schaefer. Some of you might have heard of her. Monica Schaefer. So Monica Schaefer, my wife and I have this thing before COVID anyway called Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, where we invite somebody who's reputed to be as vile as you can possibly get. And so we invited Monica Schaefer to dinner. Okay. There's Monica Schaefer, who, by the way, is a Holocaust denier. I mean, she's not like Tony, who simply says, let's question it. Oh no, she is a Holocaust denier. And so here, and I'm Jewish, right? So I'm sitting at the table, sitting next to me is Monica Schaefer, right? And we're having this lovely dinner together, kind of thing. We even hugged at the end of the evening, and now the thing is this: from the time that we invited her first for dinner, she was already kind of a Holocaust denier, but she wasn't she wasn't an anti-Semite. She didn't think there was some kind of international Jewish conspiracy. By the way, there is an international Jewish conspiracy to take over the world, but it's a conspiracy, for Christ's sake. So shh, don't tell anybody. And what pisses me off about the international Zionist conspiracy is they're not telling me. And I'm Jewish. I feel excluded. But anyhow, the story about Monica is this: because she was so she was mobbed and scorned by her community. This was Jasper, Alberta. That drove her out. And people need companionship. People need friends. And this mobbing of Monica Schaefer drove her into the arms of the most vile anti-Semites imaginable. So when we invited her back for another dinner, after she'd spent a year, by the way, in a German prison for denying the Holocaust, so she comes back to Canada. We invited her for a second dinner. Now she turned completely, I'm sorry to say it, but I mean, absolutely nuts. I mean, now there were Jewish conspiracy everywhere, and this is what you do when you drive people up, when you drive people away, right? I mean, what you're going to, this attempt at Frances, right? I mean, Frances was, a perfectly reasonable person. And then and what's happened is because of this mobbing. I mean, look at her now. You can just see she's growing horns on the top of her head and so on. This hasn't happened to Rebecca yet, but I can see it. So anyhow, so one of the things we want to do is when somebody takes a position that you think is a bit bizarre, invite them to dinner. That's how to keep them, to prevent them from becoming more bizarre. Right? Anyhow. I just want to check if there's any more notes I was making here as we go through. I think so. Yeah, I just wanted I just want to re-emphasize once more how very, very temporary and very precious this thing is that we've enjoyed in academia for the last I don't know, 50 years or something like that, whatever it might want to say. It's as rare as it is precious. And the fact that it's under threat now, and it really is under threat, I think shouldn't surprise us. But I think the case that if we're trying to prevent a further deterioration of this, the case has to be made to the public about how precious this thing is. And that's a difficult case to make to the widow whose mite is paying our salary, right? Because she doesn't realize just exactly, you know, first of all, how rare it is, but also how precious it is. Anyway, I think I'll shut up now and we want to move on to, but just a couple of comments that just arose in my mind as I was listening to the other speakers. And apologies for Francis for my deep insults, but by the way, my hostility to Francis, which is deep, and it's personal, is precisely because she's got 6,000 signatures and I got nothing. And it just isn't fair. Anyway.
So should we open it up for questions? Is that what we want to do next? Does that sound good?
Yeah, if we want to move on to the question part, I can, I have a list of questions that have come in already. So
Okay.
maybe we can start with Rhoda if she wanted to ask her question first.
Do you want me to ask it out loud?
Yeah, you sent me one question, but then you sent a second one. So the second one, maybe you
The
wanted
second one is the
to ask,
important
yeah.
one. Yeah,
Yeah.
so my question is for Rebecca. As I told you, I'm writing an article about your incident. And so I read some of the critics, and a lot of them talked about how you were white. And then somebody intervened somewhere along the way and said, by the way, she's the granddaughter of 2 Holocaust survivors. So my question is, first of all, is that true? But more importantly, why did you decide not to engage in identity politics when you replied to your critics?
Yes, thanks for that great question. It is true that, yeah, both my grandfathers were survivors and we lost several family members in the Holocaust, which did take place for, you know, any other. So yeah, there was actually some pressure I received from folks to say you're Jewish, kind of play your oppression card. And I felt strongly that 2 things, right? One is that's disrespectful, really, and exploitative in a way that I think is unjustified, right? To sort of exploit, you know, my family history for the purpose of protecting myself against a completely unjustified mob. I just couldn't defend that. And secondly, I think we have to fight back against this widespread idea that if you are not a member of the relevant group, you can't weigh in and you can't say anything of value. I think that's a really widespread and pernicious idea. And I actually think, ironically, it is often racist and sexist. So to treat an individual as if they could be representative of, you know, the views of an entire group just because they have that group membership is reductive and homogenizing. So yeah, I have lots of principled objections to it. But yeah, it was definitely some pressure. And then some folks who said, you should have said in your article that you're Jewish, because some people were pissed off that you used the example of Jewish conversion. And I just thought, why on earth does that matter? I mean, Jewish conversion is a thing that exists despite the fact, or regardless of the fact that I happen to be Jewish, you know? So yeah, I understand the temptation some have, and I think we see it increasingly with efforts to kind of pour through parts of our identities to, you know, for the sake of self-defense, but I think it's totally wrong. So thanks for that question.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Andrew Roman, if you wanted to come on. If he doesn't come on, I'm going to read his question because I think it's interesting. But
can you hear me now?
very good, thanks. Yeah.
I was just wondering why, when fighting back, people didn't conduct lawsuits against either the university for breach of contract or the mob people who sign these things. They're not anonymous, you know who they are, and they're making defamatory statements.
well, I have, just to answer from my perspective. So one of my colleagues a few years ago called me a pathetic racist. And then when I sent him an email CC to all administration, said that my work would make the Nazis proud. And I did contemplate suing defamation lawsuit at the time, but and it's something that's still being, I don't really know. It's very expensive, for one thing, to do it. Secondly, at the time, I was still under the impression that I wanted to open up discussion. Like, lawsuits doesn't have a very good effect of trying to get to the reasons for why people think the things that they do. It makes people fearful. And I was hoping, as a free speech advocate, to sort of tease out why, what racism is, and why my views are not racist, and so on. So that was historically the reason why. But I just listened to an interesting discussion between James Lindsay, Peter Boghossian, and Benjamin Boyce, and they were talking about this, that's the only way they think that the universities can perhaps be put back onto the right path, is by a bunch of people getting sued. So historically, that was the reason why I never pursued it.
I'll just add really briefly that I think that can often be the way to go, and increasingly folks are talking about appealing to the law, and also these laws, kind of the right to be forgotten laws, internet laws that are active in some countries. But I know in my own case, as a pre-tenure faculty member also, who was maybe hoping to possibly move into another job at a certain point, the perception of being kind of litigious is one that can work against you also. So yeah, that's one consideration, in addition to how expensive it is. But lots of folks raise money, and and we're willing to raise money, actually.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is from Sink McRae.
Hi, first of all, thanks everyone for your contributions to the discussion. I thought they were really interesting, and I've just been thinking a little bit about the question about what we can do. I do have a question, but I'm a philosopher, so I'm going to ramble a little bit. I just wanted to add on a little bit to what Francis was saying about the things we can do. First of all, though, I think one thing that we should do as members of SAFS is vigorously challenge the idea that academic freedom protects professional incompetence, which is often exhibited by critical theory extremists and ideologues, and also that it is something that privileges them from a justice perspective to say the kinds of things that they do. So I think there are actually two parts to that argument. One is that wokeists are rife with, there's so many ironies and also contradictions in the things they say. But academic freedom was never supposed to be a protection for professional incompetence. So they tend to be very bad at critical thinking, first of all. And secondly, it's the subversionary nature of their agenda that disqualifies them from the protections of academic freedom. And I know that sounds like an anti-dissent argument, but I don't really think it is. So there's a very nice argument by Andrew Potter and Joseph Heath in their book, The Rebels Cell, Why the Culture Can't Be Damned. And what they argue is that we need to discriminate between dissent or dissidence and social deviance. And in fact, what critical theory ideologues engage in is social deviance, not dissent. So I would distinguish between a right to freedom of expression, which is justified by things like the need for personal fulfillment and participation in a democracy, and the underlying basis for academic freedom, which I think is narrower, which is primarily grounded on honest pursuit of truth. But if you deny there's such a thing as truth, how can you argue that it's the pursuit of truth that justifies your right to academic freedom? That makes no sense whatsoever. So first of all, I think we need to educate administration and also our colleagues and also broader society about the actual basis of academic freedom. It's not supposed to be protection or subversion. Social deviance, Potter and Heath argue, is based in the idea that all conformity is coercion. And that's just totally outrageous and irrational. We need conformity in order to enjoy the benefits of cooperation. So it's the subversive nature of the conformity that, or sorry, it's the subversive nature of the arguments that that ideologues make that we really need to be, I guess, vigilant against or protecting ourselves against. Related to that, I was just thinking, like I said, about what Francis was saying about things that we can do. I wrote a few letters of dissent, and one of the things that in the last year or so, one of the things that surprised me about that was that I received a number of unexpected replies from students and parents of students and contract faculty who I told all of them that I never would publicly identify any of them, but I was surprised by how many of them said that they'd been wanting to say this kind of thing, but just haven't spoken up. And that made me think that one thing we can do as faculty members is, one thing I've started to do, is I posted a notice and these letters as well on my websites for my courses. Basically try to indicate to my students that my classes are places where the consideration of a wide variety of ideas is welcome. And my hope is that I follow through on that in the actual practice of the class, because of course you can be a hypocrite and say one thing and do another. But what they said in the letters and messages that I've received from them is that they know right away in a course whether or not a thought crime is committed by even entertaining, let alone defending, a view that's considered out of bounds. Not just by the profs, which is obviously terrible, because you can see that the role of an academic is different from the role of an activist here. And that's a form of indoctrination, obviously, but by their peers as well. So what to do about that? I guess my question, though, is whether the two of you, Francis and Rebecca, in particular, have also received feedback from people who responded to your situations in ways that were actually encouraging, gave you hope that there actually are a number of people out there who are looking for people with voices to protect their interests. Okay, I'll stop there and let you take it over.
Did you want to say something, Francis? Or? Yeah, I think there are so many people terrified about cancel culture in academia and beyond, and the amount of people I heard from and still hear from who are just eminently reasonable on these issues, right? Who would not engage in this manner is really encouraging. The problem is that it's totally terrifying, right? To put yourself out there, and you know that there's some folks who are arguing that we have a moral duty, and Francis, maybe this is what you're suggesting, we have a moral duty to put ourselves out there publicly, and I think that that's right, and yet on the personal individual level, right, the risk can be great, and so, but yeah, my sense is that it really is a smaller minority, just a very vocal minority. And there's also a distinction between what people will say publicly and what they'll say privately, which is very telling too. You know, I had some feminists communicate with me in a certain way privately, but then publicly I would see them like liking different critical comments about me or even posting things, which really suggests that this might not be their well-considered views, but it's really just motivated by the fear of being ostracized from the group and community that they identify with. So we need people to tap into their courage more and their willingness to possibly be, you know, excised from a community, but for reasons that would be unjustified. And at the end of the day, they could stand up and say, well, at least I kept my integrity intact.
Yes. And I think I used to, I guess it was 2 years ago, things have changed for me now because I used to be much more optimistic about the university than I am now, just by looking at what's happened over the last year. And I used to say to people that really you have a duty. If you have tenure, you have a duty to speak up. And that's why you have tenure, is to do that. But to look at the absolutely appalling reaction to my case that has happened over the past year at Mount Royal University, a university that I would never have thought, like, I thought it was a pretty good climate there. I really did. And it just turned. So now, you know, you really do have a question there as to whether I will be pushed out. Like, I really did never thought that that ever was going to happen. But because the faculty association is so compromised, and because we are so dependent on our faculty associations in Canada to fight for us, it's really not known what is going to happen. So that's the difficulty, I think, is that we need to have organization. This really is going to have to be the major work that's done. And, you know, I really think that it should be done nationally, internationally, and on a university-wide basis, where you get people together at universities and build up. And I just saw this happen, I think it was at McGill. They had a Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship local chapter. Like, we need to build those local chapters up in the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship so people can have a network of people that they can rely upon. I'm currently dealing with a number of, like, I've been contacted by a number of faculty members who are in trouble, and I try to work with them, but they don't have any network in their own institution. And that must be incredibly frightening for those people. For me, I have the Rational Space Network. So I have, you know, Sinclair McRae is a very, very good colleague, and a bunch of others. So I was never alone. So I at least have that kind of thing. But I think it's very, very difficult for people who are alone. And I think that's where we got to go, is just, you know, build up the local chapters at each university.
Thank you. I'm going to call on Christine in just a moment, but I just want to say, when I was in graduate school, I used to occasionally say things that were anti-Islamist in nature, and I actually got a number of people who responded almost with absolute rage at these. And these are people who are completely irreligious and weren't Muslim or anything, but they became exceptionally angry. So I can understand, like, how people are not really willing to speak out on the things that they actually believe because of the risk of getting a very negative reaction from their peers or their professors. But I'm going to pass it over to Christina for her question.
Thank you for the really fascinating talks. You guys can hear me, right? I see here our feedback is we buy Francis's books as birthday presents. My birthday is coming up, April 4th, so I hope to get at least one book. But that's not really what I wanted to say. When I was listening to Rebecca's presentation, you were talking about the values of the in-group and how important it is for people to be members of those groups and then also, like, reassert their values and that kind of stuff. That really reminded me of growing up in East Germany, where we had exactly the same problem. And the funny thing is, there are very few people that actually hold and defend those values. Most of the people don't. And you're absolutely right. It is important to encourage them, and it's important, as Francis said, to, like, fight back and that kind of stuff. But also, from my experience growing up in East Germany, one of the things that we learned the hard way is you have to do it indirectly. And I think we are at that point now. And yes, you need community, but if you have a community that is putting on their banner academic freedom, we are the ones that are under scrutiny, and if somebody is doing something wrong, they know how to find us, and they also know how to discourage people to join groups like that. So in East Germany, for instance, one of the things that worked in the end really well is church groups. It doesn't matter if you're actually religious or not. So right now it may be, as Robert was just saying, it may be more kind of valuable to engage with Muslim people. You are Jewish, so you could do that. So those kind of things where you actually meet people and where you get them to talk to you versus telling them that they should speak up and that kind of stuff. I think we really have, unfortunately, reached the point where we need to do that. And I actually think we are very different from the free speech troubles in the 1960s, because back then it was kind of the administration telling students what they could and could not say. Now it's the bloody students who want us to shut up. And I mean, so that's why we also cannot like reach out to parents, because their own kids at times say, no, we don't feel safe when Frances says whatever she is saying in her classroom. And so it's really, really important that we actually change our strategies from this kind of combative way to get to people over other means and find out how unhappy some of them actually are with the party line.
Yeah, thank you so much for that point. I haven't given this much thought, but I'm thinking right now that maybe one feature of being in an echo chamber is that you don't realize you're in an echo chamber. I think that that's part of what Talisa's diagnosis of polarization implies, that you can see how much the opposition is affected by the dynamics of polarization, and yet you can't see it in yourself, which is really scary. I mean, I will say, I think I needed to be canceled to fully appreciate my own echo chambers. And I was already somebody who had dissented against the common line in certain ways. So that's really scary too. And I think for that reason, because Talise argues that what happens with polarization is that you view your political opponents as much more kind of depraved or evil or misguided than they actually are. Like, that's a feature of it. And so if you're not rehabilitating your perception of your political opponents through apolitical interactions, it's likely that you're just going to react, right, to whatever they say without actually being able to listen. So social media, insofar as it contributes to those polarization dynamics, is a massive part of the problem here. I mean, I know this isn't unique historically, but I think at least in our contemporary moment, the particular contributions of social media, and he argues too, physical spaces are increasingly polarized as well. But like the likelihood that you will encounter folks of your similar political persuasion at the grocery store, at the coffee shop, like in the States, the liberals are at Whole Foods, and the conservatives are shopping at or he says maybe Costco versus Sam's Club, or I think Starbucks versus Dunkin' Donuts, and that spaces are increasingly polarized too. So we have way fewer and fewer interactions with people, such that the opportunity to view our political opponents not as just depraved, evil individuals is dramatically decreased. I guess that's my big plug for that Talise book. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I'm going to call on Gabor next to ask.
It's very nice seeing a number of familiar faces here, and I would like to start with a comment and then with a question. In terms of the decline that we see in academic freedom throughout Canadian and even North American universities, I do wonder whether it may be related to objective economic reasons of declining number of academic jobs being available. So for every position, there may be hundreds of people literally applying, and universities more and more looking for obedient employees rather than autonomous researchers who are engaging in pursuit of truth. That type of structural economic reasons may explain some of the individual experiences that many of us have experienced. We can, of course, think that university administrators are evil or mean-spirited, but I would be more looking for structural reasons. When we see the same pattern across many universities, it has more to do with the structure of the sociology and the economics of universities than just individual traits of a negative selection. The other question I would like to put out there is suggest a different direction for looking at some of the issues that were mentioned by Francis, which seem to suggest some parallel with what you see in national security matters in federal courts, for example, in Canada. If you tell a federal court judge, we have a case which involves national security, it creates a moral panic. Oh, we must be dealing with a terrorist. It immediately justifies dealing with the particular case behind closed doors in secrecy. Exactly the type of problems that you see also, coincidentally, in those respectful workplace environment type of procedures that are being invoked, and they are being used also as a way of silencing dissent. The cure for both, in my view, is looking through charter rights and charter challenges. What I'm proposing is twofold, and I must mention, as a mathematician, carrying out this plan is way beyond my capacity or means, but I do feel there is some parallelism that could be explored. On the one hand, the literature which is available on the sociology and legal theory around those secret hearings that you have could be equally applicable to the academic context. In Canada, they have those type of procedures under Section 38 of the Canada Evidence Act. You have it under Section 83 of the Immigration Refugee Protection Act. You have some proceedings involving CSIS that would be such. And if you look even at our, it was mentioned before, access to information and privacy, under those legislations, in some cases, there is a God-given right to the Crown to have secret hearings, ex parte no less, where only they and the judge are present. There has been some critical theory, legal theory going into this, some case law that could be quite useful. The reason I'm bringing this up because Alberta is a province where you may remember that to some limited extent, universities have been recognized as being subject to the charter. I'm referring in particular to the prison cases, which was more towards students. I'm not sure to what extent it would work vis-a-vis faculty, where there is an employment relationship. But if it really, one can show this is a true freedom of speech matter, perhaps some of those authorities, those cases that have been used to establish constitutional rights and to attack excessive secrecy in national security cases could also be applied to universities, because after all, the public is entitled to know how those universities are functioning. So a massive, some form of legal challenge, not necessarily to sue individual defamers, which is also not a bad idea, but to look at the whole system of secrecy and ask, for example, can a university sign an agreement with a faculty? You mentioned that with a faculty who left and therefore cannot talk. Can they sign an agreement which the faculty agrees to remain silent about any issue? Does it really not unduly violate their freedom of speech by a state actor, which is the university?
Yes, well, this is areas that I currently am investigating. It's difficult because not being an expert, my current plan is to try to operate with, like, I've got it all. I've got all the information that I've kept in a big package, a big box of all the stuff. And like, if I'm just worried about pulling the trigger too soon on all of it. Like, I want to get as much as I can within the processes themselves to sort of see what the thought processes are that are going on inside of the institution. And I have got some very interesting material. But for now, like it's the option. Like I always have the option of going that route. That's my own view. But right now I'm just going to doggedly pursue. I'm going to go by, follow the rules that have been set out for me and see how it goes. And in the end, I think that could be a very useful avenue to pursue.
I'll just add that, Gabby, I think what we need is a test case, because one of the problems that we face is that so few, as you know, of these cases end up going to arbitration. They get settled in advance. And so few of them are set up well enough, right, from the beginning, partly because most faculty members who find themselves in, subject to harassment investigation don't have the best advice. And so they don't know how to protect themselves all the way along, right? And so that's part of the problem, is that you end up with a case that is maybe not so great on the face of it, and then we can't even get them to go to arbitration because the unions won't take it to arbitration. And then, of course, you have that added problem that you mentioned, where faculty members are subject to those confidentiality agreements when they get bought out. So there's so many things that push back against actually changing the law, right? And getting our charter rights recognized within universities. And, from the discussions I've had with lawyers on this question, they will all say that we don't have Section 2B rights as employees within the institution. But there's an argument to be made against that, in the sense that that particular case dealt with the financial side of the university, right? It dealt with the question of whether or not the university could impose a mandatory age limit on retirement. It didn't deal with the other side, the academic side of the university. And unlike the students who've got the Pridgeon case to protect them, faculty members don't have a case like that in Canada that has actually said, yes, faculty members in their employment relationships inside universities have freedom of expression rights. Right now, the only thing that protects us are the collective agreements that write in the academic freedom provisions. And so if we lose those academic freedom provisions, it's going to get even worse. I mean, I would argue we've probably already lost them, since unions don't really protect them anyway. So it's just more or less, written on paper. But I would really like to see a case go to the court so that we could start to push back in that way using the law. And maybe what needs to happen is I need to write an article about it and get it published.
One of the problems with all of this is that even though unions are meant to be vehicles to protect faculty and protect members, it's often becoming tools of oppression itself, where because the union is acting as an exclusive bargaining agent, it means that individual members are giving away their right to take individual legal action on their own. And as a result, unless the union is willing to take the case forward, there's not much that the faculty can do other than perhaps a complaint for breach of duty of fair representation under labor laws, which is a quite high threshold. It's the labor boards are very loath to interfere with the unions in their works. The other question is, how do those union leaders, executives get elected? Do they really represent the faculty? And if they do represent the faculty, then really what can be done about it? If the majority of the faculty believe that that's how things should be, then
yes.
Then is it even changeable? And if it is not changeable, what is the remedy? Perhaps go to found a different university which has a different environment, which collects more people who are the same way that people at those universities which have those very employer-friendly unions have perhaps a majority of faculty who believe that you should follow the pack. There could be a more dissenting type of atmosphere at some university where dissent is encouraged and even valid. Even perhaps one of your conditions for getting tenure is that you have at least dissented on two cases during your probation.
Yes, and this is part of the problem with my case right now is the Mount Royal Faculty Association up until around 2018 was a very fair faculty association. And that was kind of one of the problems is everyone sort of took it for granted that it worked well. And then very, very quickly, it became, dominated by people with this reified postmodern viewpoint. And they've been doing the most outrageous things that you would not imagine, which a number of us have been, really trying to expose and criticizing. And then we tried to elect another slate that would be a non-ideological slate, and it was completely unsuccessful because the whole membership doesn't seem to understand the danger at this point. And this kind of feeds into the deeper cultural problems within the institution, is that people don't seem to understand that it is very dangerous to have this politicization of faculty associations and universities. They sort of see it almost as, this is just being a good person to support this, when what they're doing is that they're emboldening a particular faction that now is just controlling everything. And even now with the faculty association, we have all these events that are being held, and originally the events had open questions, so it would be like this kind of forum, and now they've changed the events so that you have to put your questions in the the chat or sort of thing that goes directly to the moderator, and the moderator just weeds out all the questions which they don't like, and that's just happened within the last and it just is snowballing. And because they control the communications, and they won't give you the list of members. So you have no way of communicating. You can go and search around, try and find it out. But anyway, it's just a complete disaster. And I don't know, it has to be kind of grassroots organizing. I guess that's supposed to have happened. And that's kind of part of the larger problem.
Hello. I've moved to another room. We will have Lucy Schwartz for her question next.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing the event and for the panelists about sharing their experience and thoughts. So I share the concern about cancel culture and academic mobbing, and I take very seriously the harms that are being done to individuals who are targets of this kind of mobbing. And I agree that people who engage in it, like as in Rebecca's and Francis' case, often are just trying to engage in virtue signaling, or they don't want to be criticized by their in-group, or they just, maybe they just want attention. Like often, I assume the motives aren't very good. And in those cases, I think your focus here is right, that we just need to focus on how to control the problem. But then a lot of people who engage in these online mobs are sincere. They just think they're upset about the kind of research that's being done, not because it's politically incorrect, but because they really believe that it is doing harm. And so I'm thinking, for example, in the case of Rebecca, I'm not familiar with Francis, or I wasn't familiar with Francis's case before coming here today, but I was familiar with Rebecca's case. And I remember when this all unfolded and I was following it online, and all the terrible things that were said. But one thing that stuck out to me, there was this trans scholar and feminist scholar, Talia Betcher, who was part of the mob, and she wrote online about how, she was desperate. Like I read her post and she said, I can't believe this. People keep telling me I'm crazy when I criticize the article and say that it's doing harm. They keep telling me I'm an aggressor. And she's like this trans woman who's probably had a lot of challenges in her life. And, you know, this entire community is subjected to such terrible injustice and violence. And, you know, we want to certainly take individuals like that seriously. And so I sometimes struggle a little bit with how to navigate this landscape where, on the one hand, I'm very much worried about academic mobbing and, you know, stifling free speech and people being in fear about what they can say and not say. But on the other hand, I also certainly want to take victims of injustice and discrimination seriously, who are saying this research is doing harm and something needs to be done about it. And so I'm not entirely sure how to navigate these pulls from different directions, and was thinking what your thoughts are on how to navigate this. That at the one time, yeah, we have to do something against academic mobbing, and, you know, there is a problem there. On the other hand, we also want to take seriously the individuals who are engaging in the mobbing, the ones who are sincere. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, can I jump in here? Thanks. I think this is a great question. So I want to say two things in response to that. The first is that I think there's a really, really important distinction between canceling and criticizing or critiquing, let's say. So I think canceling as a phenomenon involves kind of rejecting the entire person out of the community, right? That's what the element of shame does. I think shame attaches to the whole person, and it's like, you are no longer someone with whom we ought to engage, right? Talia Betcher, right, who's a very prominent trans feminist theorist, I mean, she didn't sign the open letter against me. You know, she wrote some things that I would say are closer to critique, because I don't recall her, at least from what I remember, you know, making calls for the article to be retracted. But I think that's the key distinction. And we're talking about fellow academics, right? So I think the need to engage in critique and dialogue actually goes up. Like, this is someone in your field, you know, and you're a philosopher, you know, you should come to the table with discourse and reasons, and yeah, maybe some of that can be, hey, you know, here is how I, you know, receive this research as harmful. But that gets me to the second point, which is the conceptual inflation of so many terms now, like harm and racism. And, you know, the degree to which the term harm was bandied about in my case was actually really offensive, I think, to real victims of harm, right? To say that my article was like doing harm to trans people and people of color is just, I think, to trivialize, honestly, the kind of real concrete harm that takes place and that happens to many of those individuals, as you're noting. So I would say we have to keep distinctions intact, and philosophers are really good at that, right? Like, what's the difference between, you know, harm and offense and other related concepts? So those are some of the things that I would say there. You know, I think one of the worst parts of online mobbing in academia, I think, is that it really threatens to make you into a worse thinker and a worse knower, because you're not in conversation as much with the people who disagree with you. And I think that means you're way less likely to get at the truth, right? Like, folks like us who talk a lot about canceling and who aren't maybe talking as much to the folks who are on the other side are suffering an epistemic deficit, I would say, by not hearing from those folks, right? So whatever we can do to remedy the situation enough to create dialogue, I think is really crucial. So yeah, thanks. I think it's a really important question.
Yes, and I think so too. And I noticed that Sink McRae, and I've also heard Mark Mercer talk about this distinction as well, which is between rightful harm and wrongful harm. So many of the people who are saying that this is harmful are saying it's harmful because they subjectively feel that they are now suffering some kind of psychological kind of disturbance. And I think that is a very, very dangerous road to be going down in a university, because we first of all, we have to have the discussion to try to sort out the truth from the falsity and so on. And often a lot of things are mixed up together. And what it does, it just creates a chill on the entire discussion. And we've got a lot of neuroses that are festering now in the university. Like, I am quite surprised at how terrible things have become at Mount Royal University. We had, for example, on I think it was Thursday, an anti-racism open mic put forward by the Students Association, and this has been rumbling along now for about a year, since the George Floyd killing and so on. And I'm right in the eye of the storm of this. And all these students were all emoting about how terrible everything was. And I was just amazed at how, these things they were talking about were trivial. Were really, really trivial, or were completely off the charts in terms of basically saying you couldn't put forth an academic argument because this was upsetting for them and so on. When really, what we need to do is we need to have the discussion about this, as to what these positions are, but that is just cut off because everyone is so worried that the students are upset. And we don't want the students to be upset. We want them to feel that they belong at Mount Royal, and they're claiming that they don't feel that they belong because we don't recognize their identities and we don't do this and that. And this is just, I think, has gone way, way, way too much along this concern for harm, which is now being interpreted as, just some kind of psychological disturbance because an idea is being expressed that you disagree with. I think that's a real problem at universities right now.
Can I push this inquiry a bit on Lucy just for 1 second? I just want to see just exactly what you're proposing here. I mean, Jonathan Haidt is famous for having said, look, you can have two kinds of universities, the ones that are pursuit of truth versus the pursuit of social justice. So let me provide a case in which you really have to make a choice between this. And I'd like to know which way you'd go on this. So, because what I want to argue is that there are certain truths which are inimical to social justice. For example, the Creek Nation of eastern Oklahoma bought and sold and worked Black slaves. Okay, so I mean, and furthermore, slavery was not brought to North America by the Europeans. Slavery was in the entire North American continent, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast. We're well familiar with slavery, but nevertheless, indigenous people, because indigenous people are people, and people sometimes, resort to slavery for certain economic reasons. Now, bringing this to light in the midst of a time where we're concerned about the dignity of indigenous peoples, especially here in Western Canada, right? Are you suggesting, and this is not a rhetorical question, Lucy, okay? I mean, I'm putting it on the table. Are you suggesting that I ought not to have blogged about this precisely because it's inimical to a particular social movement? Because it is. I acknowledge that this is not helpful to the plight of indigenous people in Western Canada to point this out. Should I shut up? Is that what you're saying, Lucy?
So it sounds like you actually want me to respond, right?
I do. I do.
Yeah. No, I don't, because I'm on the free speech side. But I know all these sincere people who are my friends and colleagues who would say that. And so I'm trying to figure out how to engage with them, because they're not stupid, they're not evil, they're not insincere, they're not just virtue signaling. They wholeheartedly believe that we should not publish articles like that. And I'm sort of, and I find it easier to talk with people if they're just allies. They're not actually, say, Indigenous people, or they're not actually transgender, but they're just allies. But especially when it comes to the people that are directly affected, so that are, say, themselves Indigenous people, and if they stand there and say sincerely, this is wrong, I'm like, how can we communicate? How can we be on the same page? Because you are my fellow human being and my fellow, well, not citizen, I'm not a citizen, resident. And like, we have to live together, and I don't want to be against you. I'm with you. I want to be with you, not against you. And how can we, I'm just not sure how to engage or how to make us come to the same page and signal to them, look, I am taking you seriously. I understand that you suffer from oppression, and I think that's important. But I also think that we have to be able to say these truths, even if they're uncomfortable. And so I'm pretty much just struggling with how to navigate it. Yeah.
Well, I think personally, I think we're giving far too much credence to these people, to all these people who are clamoring to say that they have all these, they're marginalized and so on. Like, the people who are in universities to begin with are privileged people, right? Like, this is, and the privileges are now becoming more and more and more, so that it's now everyone's looking for this kind of victim type of status that then they can use to claim that you should not be saying things. So I almost find we almost need to go back in the opposite direction and say, look, and as Paul was saying, the university I want to be involved in is the Truth University that Jonathan Haidt is talking about. If you have a Truth University, there's going to be people who are going to be upset by ideas that are being put forward, and we've completely lost that. Anyone who, like, listening to that litany of non things happening to a bunch of students who have been mobilized for a year by various people with agendas, it's completely tearing the university apart. So, I would really like an administrator to sort of say, stand up and say, look, we're an academic institution, right? If you've got some difficulties in dealing with these ideas, you need to sort them out. It's not the university's business to be holding your hand and trying to figure out how to help you to deal with ideas that you find to be distressing. That will destroy the university. That's my view, anyway. Not very popular.
I just wanted to jump in. I love this question because I think it helps us get at what's really tricky about these cases. So thanks for it. I think one thing that's really hard too in the era of social media is that the idea that we can cleanly distinguish between the academic and non-academic spaces is mistaken, right? I published my article behind a paywall in a philosophy journal, read mostly by progressive feminists and others, and it got out to tons of people in the public, right? Now, I think there's a really important question here. Do I think there would be an important difference between publishing my article behind that paywall for a particular audience of individuals and like getting up in front of a big public group of people and maybe saying, if transgender, then trans race, and all the implications that you might think follow from that? I mean, those are different, right? And I think that that's part of what's happening right now too, is that increasingly the blurriness of the lines is making folks worry about like something that just might be published in an academic space, but then being taken up and used for nefarious purposes. I still think at the end of the day, you can't police academic research on those grounds, because then you're in the business of trying to guess what is and is not going to be used or taken up in certain ways for particular pernicious reasons. And I think that's really messy. But I do want to validate the fact that I think those who point out that the academic and non-academic spaces are increasingly blurry have a point. And that's, I think, what drives a lot of the concern of the folks you're mentioning, who I agree are like, we need to be careful that we're not belief polarizing and we're not just in our own echo chamber and homogenizing all those on the other side. Like, Francis, we talked last time about how John Stuart Mill says, you got to go to the folks who believe it to hear the best articulation of the view. That's, I think, again, what's so unfortunate. We don't have as many of those folks in the conversation as would be ideal, because maybe we would hear things that are more compelling and require us to take some of the concerns more seriously, which I take it is what Lucy kind of in playing devil's advocate here. I take it as a philosopher. Lucy's also a philosopher.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we had a discussion once about Israel where they had diverse perspectives. So we had like three pro-Palestinian speakers and 0 pro-Israel. So that was their idea of diversity at my university. So we're going to move on to a question from Kirsten, if you wanted to come on.
I'm here, yeah. Hi. My question is for Ken. In anticipation of the panel today, I went back and looked at John Feckety's book, Moral Panic, Biopolitics Rising, where he talks about many of these cases in Canada dating back to the early 90s and, what we used to call PC culture back then. And what kind of surprised me is, I guess, how long this has been going on for, particularly as it related to the institutions themselves using the new discrimination policies to investigate faculty members. And I guess I was wondering what you think about this question in terms of solutions, because I can't for the life of me sometimes understand why university administrators will pursue these cases and why it is they can't see that it's a product of academic mobbing. And I mean, you've been doing this work for decades now, and it seems to me that that's something that university administrators ought to have as part of their kind of moral and ethical framework when they're making these kinds of decisions, particularly since the processes themselves can be so abusive, if you know what I mean. So I guess I'm just sort of wondering, that maybe that's not a very pointed question, but I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about whether or not there's value in really starting to maybe do some more work as a collective on academic mobbing and getting the information to administrators in some way. Not, you've been doing this for a lot of your career.
Well, thanks for the question. I remember back in the mid-1990s thinking that was when the Bob Rae government was in power in Ontario, which was a very politically correct government, and it promoted, I would say, a kind of culture of grievance. And thinking, this is all going to blow over in 6 months or a year with the next government that gets elected. And of course, it hasn't. It's gotten worse. And the reason is, I think there are lots of reasons, but the basic reason is trends in the economy that disempower lots of people, while at the same time providing a fairly decent standard of living, enabling people to engage in, enabling universities to waste stupendous amounts of money on sheer craziness with no penalty. And I think a whole lot of what's going on in universities these days is just, it's utter waste of money. But people make their living at it. Administrators have only to gain from handling all kinds of grievances and disputes. What I've observed over time, and there's a nice book by somebody in the US, I forget, The Fall of the Faculty, there's been a shift in power over the past 40 or 50 years from the faculty to an autonomous group of administrators who basically run the institution. The idea that professors are the university is so completely passé, whatever. So what you have is what Alan Kors identified 30 years ago, a shadow university of all kinds of associate deans of this and that and the other thing, offices of diversity and anti-harassment and anti-bullying, and then lawyers, a whole corps of lawyers who make their living off of it. And so there's an interest in not solving problems. Most of the disputes, the spats that occur in universities can be resolved if the two professors involved talk with one another, hammer things out. Maybe they quit talking to one another for a year, but whatever. But what makes money, what pays for the salaries of administrators and lawyers, is when that little dispute between two professors or 5 professors or whatever gets bumped up into a grievance case, legal case, where then you just waste a lot of money messing with it. I wanted just to add a note to just a couple of things. I was really, really glad for Paul's reference to René Girard earlier, for understanding the process of mobbing. Girard's work is really indispensable. And I'm very grateful for him mentioning his name. Some of Girard's work is pretty hard to read. One of his last books, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, it's a funny title, is much more accessible than his book, The Scapegoat, for instance. But I also wanted to say a word about, we've had a number of discussions here about how to fight back. If you're being mobbed, what the hell do you do? You know, what steps do you take? And over the years, many hundreds of professors have written to me in desperation saying, you know, on the basis of your research, what should I do? And I'm always really hesitant to give specific advice because everybody's situation is different. Every mobbing case is different. And every mobbing target has to carefully assess his or her resources. What's going to work and what's not. For instance, how much support do you have from your colleagues in the department? How much support do you have from your family? Mobbing tends to hit hardest those people who live alone, who live entirely for their careers. Another resource question is, what about your own personal strengths and weaknesses? I was really grateful to hear Rebecca describe the personal toll that it takes when it's like everybody's beating up on you at once. And you do become paranoid. You become hypervigilant. And some people more than others. One mobbing target whom I studied, was American by birth, but he was Buddhist by faith, with deeply committed Buddhist. He barely knew, he was a mathematician, he barely knew that he was mobbed. You know, it never touched his soul in particular at all because he was too detached from the university. While no small number of cases that I have studied, the individual who was mobbed committed suicide. So every mobbing target has to carefully assess, you know, what's my limit? What can I do? Sometimes legal action might work, and Gabor Lukács is certainly, as Air Canada and other Canadian airlines would testify, he's very adept at that. Most professors aren't, right? And I've got a whole long list of professors who have lost tens of thousands of dollars to lawyers who didn't do them a whit's worth of good. On the question that Paul mentioned about leaking documents, in principle, I like that advice, Paul, you know, to get stuff out in the open. However, every mobbing target is in a particular situation, and you've got to play your cards carefully. And what works in one situation might not work in another. So thanks for the question. That's what I wanted to respond. I have to go. 2 hours is my limit, but I'm supposed to be somewhere. But I want to thank everybody for taking part in it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have one more question from Pamela, and then I believe we're at the end of our questions for today. So if we wanted to, if Pamela wanted to come on.
Turn your mic on.
I'm not being a very good moderator.
Is Pamela there? Sorry, I have to look you up now.
We're having a hard time hearing you, Pamela.
Yeah, Pamela is still muted. Oh, there's two Pamelas on. Which one are you?
I don't know which Pamela. My question was answered, so I'm fine.
Okay. Well, in that case, we are now at the end of.
Oh, I see. There's two.
So I don't know if there is anything to sum up, or oh, sorry, I'm getting overwhelmed here.
Getting mobbed.
I'm getting mobbed. Yes, this is parental mobbing. So
Yes.
I should just say though, I should add something though, that I've been there's been attempts to cancel me at least twice. So I think there only leaves one of us that is. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm gonna mute myself. But I think I'm the only one who has. I think only one of us hasn't been. Nobody's attempted to cancel. So I do feel sorry for Paul for that. Oh, sorry.
Anyway, so if there's no more questions, I guess I should thank everyone for coming. As far as I know, there are a number of different events coming up. Bruce Party, I believe this is for the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. Bruce Party is going to be speaking, I believe, April 20th. But you can just go to the safs.ca page and it will be announcing various things. And then we have another event, which I believe Kirsten and Paul Viminitz are going to be participating in with me on risky topics. And as well, that's the Ricardo Duchenne. So we're hoping that Ricardo Duchenne will be able to participate in that event. I'm still looking for another participant. Hopefully someone who sees themselves as being on the left of the political spectrum, who thinks that a topic that is considered to be a left-wing kind of position is very difficult and risky to talk about in the academy. But anyway, so that's happening sometime in April or May. And then of course we have the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship annual general meeting, which is going to have Thomas Hudlicki, who is a professor who was recently had some serious difficulties at Brock University about diversity, inclusion, and equity types of policies, and him criticizing them in a chemistry journal, and the reaction of Brock to his situation, which should be quite interesting in terms of what he's going to be talking about there. But I just wanted to thank everyone once again for coming. I think that was a very, very interesting conversation. I look forward to seeing you at the next event that we're going to be holding. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.